Woman pregnant with dragon eggs, delivery stuns everyone. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The bright glare of hospital lights sliced through the dim hallway as a gurney wheeled quickly toward the delivery room. Emily gripped the sides of the bed, her face pale and glistening with sweat as pain rippled through her body. Her breaths came in short gasps, and her eyes darted around wildly as though trying to anchor herself to something familiar. "Hang in there, Emily," a nurse whispered, her voice calm but edged with worry. "We're almost there." "Something's wrong," Emily panted, her voice barely audible. She winced as another contraction seized her body, her abdomen tightening like a fist. "It's not normal. Something's wrong." The nurse glanced at the attending doctor walking briskly beside them. The doctor, a tall, gray-haired man named Dr. Reese, maintained a calm facade, though his furrowed brow betrayed his unease. He'd been in this business for decades, seen all kinds of complicated cases, but nothing had prepared him for Emily's condition. "Get her prepped," Dr. Reese instructed the team as they reached the operating room. Nurses swarmed around the gurney, transferring Emily to the surgical bed with careful hands. Machines beeped and monitors flashed, the hum of hospital machinery blending with the sounds of tense murmurs. Emily squeezed her eyes shut, tears leaking from the corners. "Please," she whispered, gripping a nurse's wrist so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Please help me." "We're going to help you, Emily," the nurse said, trying to keep her voice steady. But as the nurse glanced at the large curve of Emily's belly, unnaturally firm and stretched, her confidence wavered. She'd never seen anything like it. None of them had. Dr. Reese stood at the foot of the bed, pulling on his gloves as he spoke to the team. "Vitals? Stable but irregular heart rate," a nurse replied, frowning at the monitor. "It keeps spiking. Keep an eye on it," Dr. Reese said sharply. He turned to Emily, his voice lowering into the practiced calm of a seasoned professional. "Emily, we're going to deliver your baby now. I need you to focus on breathing. Can you do that for me?" Emily nodded weakly, her breath coming in shallow pants. Her body trembled as another wave of pressure pushed against her abdomen, the pain unlike anything she had ever imagined. "But I don't know what's happening," Emily whispered, tears trailing down her flushed cheeks. "I don't even know what this is." Dr. Reese exchanged a glance with one of his colleagues, Dr. Patel, a younger doctor who had been assisting with Emily's case since she first arrived at the hospital weeks ago. The look between them spoke volumes. Neither of them knew what to expect. Emily's case had confounded the medical community since the day she walked into the hospital. It had started months earlier when she first began experiencing strange symptoms: unusual pain, fainting spells, and a bloated abdomen that doctors had initially assumed was a pregnancy. But when the tests came back, they'd revealed something far stranger. "There's something unusual in your ultrasound results," Dr. Reese had told her cautiously when she'd first been admitted. He'd stared at the images for so long that Emily had finally demanded to see them herself. What she'd seen had made her stomach drop. On the grainy black and white screen were several oval shapes nestled within her abdomen. They were smooth and distinct, unlike anything a doctor had ever associated with human pregnancy. "Eggs," she had whispered then, her voice shaky. "They look like eggs." Dr. Reese had quickly dismissed her fears, trying to maintain a logical explanation. "It's likely a cluster of cysts," he'd said at the time, though his voice had lacked confidence. "We'll conduct more tests But I'm pregnant," Emily had insisted. "I can feel it." And so they had monitored her for months. Tests were inconclusive, theories fell apart, and yet her abdomen continued to grow, her body swelling as though nurturing something the doctors couldn't name. What frightened them the most was that whatever lay inside her belly was alive. Now, in the delivery room, the weight of those unanswered questions pressed down on everyone like a heavy fog. Nurses exchanged nervous glances as they prepared for what was about to happen, their faces pale behind their surgical masks. "Scalpel," Dr. Reese called, his voice tight. A nurse handed him the instrument, her hands trembling slightly. Dr. Reese hesitated for just a moment before lowering the blade to Emily's abdomen, where the skin bulged unnaturally, as though something inside was pushing outward. "Okay, Emily," he said softly, though his own heartbeat thundered in his ears. "We're going to start now. Stay with me." Emily let out a weak moan as another wave of pain racked her body. She was too exhausted to respond, her eyes fluttering as sweat beaded across her forehead. Dr. Reese steadied his hands and made the first incision. The room fell silent except for the soft snick of the scalpel slicing through skin. A nurse dabbed Emily's forehead gently as another adjusted the monitors. Dr. Patel leaned closer, her eyes fixed on the area where Dr. Reese worked. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like a living thing, pressing against everyone's chest. Dr. Reese's breath caught as he reached the layer beneath the skin, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is that?" The nurses craned their necks, their eyes widening in shock as Dr. Reese carefully pulled back the tissue. Instead of a human child, something hard and smooth glinted under the harsh surgical lights. It was a shell. "Are you seeing this?" Dr. Patel whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Reese nodded slowly, his hands steady but his mind spinning. The object beneath Emily's skin wasn't flesh. It was something unnatural, impossible. The shell was a dull, mottled blue, its surface smooth but with faint cracks forming along the edges, as though whatever was inside was trying to push its way out. "Get the imaging team back in here now," Dr. Reese ordered sharply. "We need—" A sudden sound interrupted him. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping or clicking. The medical team froze, their eyes snapping to Emily's abdomen as the sound grew louder. Tip, tip, tip. The noise echoed through the delivery room, sending chills down everyone's spines. It was coming from the shells. Emily's head lolled to the side, her voice weak. "What's happening?" Dr. Reese swallowed hard, his mind racing. "The shells, they're moving." Dr. Patel stepped closer, her gloved hands trembling as she pointed at one of the ovals. "They're hatching," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "Oh my God, they're hatching." The room erupted into chaos as the tapping grew louder, more frantic. Nurses stumbled back from the bed, their faces pale and horrified. Dr. Reese tightened his grip on the scalpel, his mind torn between fear and scientific curiosity. "This can't be real," a nurse whispered, her voice quivering. But it was real. Before their eyes, cracks began to splinter across the smooth blue surface of one of the shells. A faint glow pulsed from within, casting an eerie light onto Emily's exposed abdomen. Emily's eyes fluttered open just in time to see it. What is it?" she murmured. Dr. Reese didn't answer. He couldn't. He could only stare as the shell gave one final crack, and the room fell deathly silent. A small, clawed foot pushed through the opening. For a moment, the delivery room was suspended in absolute silence, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the world itself was holding its breath. The crack in the shell widened, spreading jagged lines across its smooth, blue surface. The tiny, clawed foot pushed further outward, followed by a second, scraping softly against the surgical drape. Emily's groggy voice broke the silence. "What is that?" Dr. Reese didn't answer. He couldn't. His hands hovered over her abdomen, frozen in place as his mind struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. Around him, the medical team was paralyzed, their faces pale behind their surgical masks. Then the shell broke completely. A soft, hissing sound escaped as a sliver of steam curled into the cold, sterile air. Slowly, impossibly, a small creature emerged, its scales shimmering with faint shades of turquoise and silver. Its body was delicate yet otherworldly, its wings folded tightly against its sides as it blinked its dark, glistening eyes. Dr. Patel let out a strangled gasp, stumbling backward into a tray of instruments that clattered to the floor. It's alive," she whispered, her voice trembling. The tiny creature made a soft chirping sound, tilting its head as though trying to focus on the stunned humans surrounding it. Emily craned her neck to see, her eyes widening in disbelief. "What is that?" she choked out, her voice hoarse. Dr. Reese finally found his voice. It's impossible," he murmured. He turned to a nearby nurse. "Get the imaging team and call security. Now." The nurse bolted from the room, her shoes squeaking against the floor. Emily's breathing grew faster as her gaze remained fixed on the creature. Not human, she whispered. I knew it wasn't human. Another shell began to crack. Dr. Reese turned his attention back to Emily's abdomen, where the other smooth ovals pulsed faintly as if responding to the first. A rhythmic tapping filled the air again, growing louder with every second. As chaos erupted in the delivery room, Emily's mind began to spiral. Everything she had gone through over the past few months came rushing back in flashes. The fear, the confusion, the isolation. She closed her eyes, her thoughts tumbling backward to the moment when all of this had begun. It had started 5 months earlier, on a cold, rainy afternoon. Emily had been hiking in the woods, something she often did to clear her mind. She had always felt most at peace surrounded by nature, with nothing but the sound of leaves rustling and birds calling overhead. That day, however, something had felt off. The forest was too quiet, the usual hum of life replaced by an eerie stillness that prickled her skin. Emily had pushed the feeling aside, blaming it on her imagination, until she stumbled across the clearing. It had been strange, unnaturally symmetrical, as though the ground itself had been carved by an unseen hand. In the center of the clearing lay a cluster of smooth, glowing stones that pulsed faintly with light. They were beautiful, otherworldly even, their surface shimmering with colors she couldn't quite name. Against her better judgment, Emily had knelt down and touched one. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt of energy had shot through her, so intense that she fell backward onto the damp earth. Her vision swam, and she remembered hearing a soft humming sound, like a melody whispered from far away. When she regained her senses, the clearing was empty and the stones were gone. At first, she'd brushed the experience off as a strange hallucination, the product of too much stress and too little sleep. But a week later, the nausea started, then the pain, and then the realization that she was pregnant. Emily's eyes snapped open as a sharp cry echoed through the delivery room, pulling her back to the present. She turned her head just in time to see Dr. Reese carefully lift the first creature from her abdomen. The tiny being squirmed in his hands, its wings fluttering slightly as though testing their strength. Its eyes, large, dark, and strangely intelligent, locked onto Emily's, and for a moment, the two of them simply stared at each other. "It's looking at me," Emily whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Oh my God, it's looking at me. It's responding to you," Dr. Reese said, his voice filled with awe. "It knows you." Dr. Patel stepped closer, her initial fear giving way to fascination as she peered at the creature. This isn't possible," she murmured. "It defies every law of biology." Another egg cracked, followed by another. Within moments, 3 more of the creatures had emerged, their soft cries filling the room like a chorus. Nurses backed away nervously as the tiny beings wriggled and chirped, their scales glinting under the lights. Dr. Reese turned to one of the nurses. "Get the neonatal team in here," he barked. "And I need isolation protocols now." "Are they dangerous?" a nurse asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Dr. Reese replied. "We don't know anything yet." Outside the delivery room, the chaos was beginning to spread. Word of Emily's delivery had leaked to the rest of the hospital, and people were whispering anxiously in the hallways. Doctors and nurses crowded outside the operating room doors, trying to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. "What's going on in there?" someone muttered. "I heard she gave birth to something. Like animals or, I don't know, monsters." "That's ridiculous," another voice replied. "It's probably some rare medical condition." "Then why are they calling for security?" Inside the delivery room, Emily's body trembled as the last of the eggs cracked open. 6 small creatures now lay nestled in soft blankets, their tiny bodies twitching as they adjusted to the world. Each one was unique, their scales shimmering in shades of blue, green, and silver. Dr. Patel crouched beside the table, observing one of the creatures closely. "They're perfect," she whispered. "Look at their wings. They're fully formed." "They're dragons," Emily said suddenly, her voice clear and certain despite her exhaustion. Dr. Reese turned to her, frowning. "What did you say?" Emily's eyes remained fixed on the tiny beings. "They're dragons," she repeated. "I don't know how, but I know. I've known for months." Dr. Reese opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the creatures again, their scales, their wings, the faint glow that seemed to pulse from within them, and he couldn't deny it any longer. "They're not human," he murmured, "but they're alive." Minutes later, security guards arrived at the delivery room, accompanied by members of the hospital administration. The scene they walked into left them speechless. The 6 small creatures lay in bassinets, their cries soft but insistent as they wiggled and chirped. Emily watched them from her bed, her exhaustion forgotten as she reached out a trembling hand to touch one of them. The creature cooed softly at her touch, its tiny wings fluttering. The head of the hospital stepped forward, his face pale. What is this?" Dr. Reese turned to face him, his expression grim. "We don't know yet," he replied. "But whatever it is, it changes everything." Emily leaned back against her pillows, tears streaming down her face as she watched the creatures she had brought into the world. For months, she had been afraid of the unknown, afraid of what people would think. But now, as she looked at them, all she felt was awe. "They're mine," she whispered softly. "They're my children." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. And in that moment, everyone in the room knew that the world had just shifted. Outside the delivery room, the tension in the hospital escalated into a full-blown frenzy. Doctors and nurses gathered in tight clusters, whispering and speculating about what had happened behind the closed doors. Security guards stood stationed at the entrance, their expressions grim and uncertain. A low hum of panic seemed to vibrate through the building as rumors swirled. "It's true, I saw them," a nurse whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief as she clutched her clipboard. "They're creatures. Dragons? Or something like them. I don't know how to describe it." "That's impossible," another doctor scoffed, though his voice wavered. "It has to be some kind of hoax. A rare mutation, maybe?" "Mutations don't chirp and glow," the nurse shot back. By now, word had started to leak beyond the hospital walls. Someone had already snapped photos through the delivery room window and sent them to the outside world. Within hours, whispers turned into headlines that splashed across news channels and social media feeds. Breaking: Woman delivers mysterious dragon eggs in local hospital. Medical anomaly or miracle? Doctors baffled by unexplained birth. Dragons are real? Scientists react to shocking hospital incident. Inside the delivery room, Emily lay motionless in her bed, her gaze fixed on the tiny creatures nestled in their bassinets. Each one had been carefully swaddled, their shimmering scales peeking out beneath soft hospital blankets. They were no longer crying but cooing softly, their delicate wings twitching every so often as though testing the air. One of the creatures blinked its dark, intelligent eyes and turned its head toward Emily. She felt something stir deep inside her, an unshakable connection, as if they could see through to her soul. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Dr. Reese stood at the far side of the room, speaking in low tones with a team of specialists who had arrived to assess the situation. Scientists, geneticists, and pediatric specialists were pouring into the hospital now, each one more stunned than the last. "This defies explanation," one of the specialists muttered, shaking his head as he observed the creatures. "Their physiology, this shouldn't exist." Dr. Patel stood beside him, her voice hushed. "They're alive, and not just alive, they're thriving. Look at their vitals." Dr. Reese glanced toward Emily, who hadn't taken her eyes off the creatures since the delivery. He walked over slowly, his expression softer than before. "Emily," he said gently, "how are you feeling?" Emily blinked, as though pulling herself from a trance. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "Tired, but they're healthy, aren't they?" Dr. Reese hesitated. "They're stable," he said carefully. "We're running tests to understand what they are exactly." "They're mine," Emily replied firmly, her voice stronger this time. "I don't care what you call them. They're my children." Dr. Reese exhaled slowly, choosing his next words carefully. "Emily, we need to know more about this. About what happened to you. You said earlier you knew they were dragons. What did you mean by that?" Emily's throat tightened as memories of the clearing flashed through her mind. The humming, the strange energy, the impossible beauty of the glowing stones. "I don't think I can explain it," she whispered. "It was like they chose me." Chose you? Dr. Reese repeated, frowning. Emily looked up at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. I know it sounds crazy, but I felt it. The moment I touched those stones, I knew something had happened to me. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I do. They're not here by accident. They were meant to be born. Dr. Reese stared at her for a long moment, unsure how to respond. Finally, he turned to Dr. Patel. We need to run more tests. Blood work, scans, genetic mapping, everything. We have to understand this. Hours passed as the hospital descended into chaos. Reporters had begun gathering outside, their cameras flashing as security guards tried to maintain order. Emily could hear the distant hum of helicopters overhead, the outside world converging on the hospital like vultures circling prey. Inside her room, Emily lay curled up in bed, her body still weak from the delivery. The 6 tiny creatures rested quietly in bassinets near her, their breathing soft and rhythmic. Every so often, one of them would let out a faint chirp, the sound soothing in a way she couldn't explain. A knock at the door startled her. Dr. Patel entered, holding a tablet and a folder of papers. Her face was pale, her expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. What is it? Emily asked, sitting up slightly. Dr. Patel hesitated before speaking. We finished the preliminary tests, she said. Emily, this is unlike anything we've ever seen. Emily's pulse quickened. What do you mean? Dr. Patel pulled up an image on her tablet, showing detailed scans of the creature's anatomy. These beings, your children, aren't human, she said softly. But they're not entirely alien either. Their DNA is like nothing we've ever encountered, but there are fragments that appear familiar. It's as though they're a hybrid of something ancient. Ancient? Emily repeated, her brow furrowing. Dr. Patel nodded. Some of the genetic markers resemble reptilian species, lizards specifically, but the structure is far more advanced. And there's something else. She flipped to another page of data. The energy readings coming from their bodies are off the charts. It's as though they're radiating a kind of low-level heat or power. Emily's mind spun as she tried to process what Dr. Patel was telling her. But they're okay, right? They're not sick. Dr. Patel offered a faint smile. They're perfectly healthy. In fact, they're thriving. It's as though they were designed to be exactly what they are. Designed, Emily whispered. Dr. Patel's smile faltered. The question is, designed by what? Meanwhile, outside the hospital, the world was beginning to spiral into chaos. News stations ran 24-hour coverage of the bizarre story, speculating wildly about the nature of Emily's pregnancy. Are dragons real? Experts weigh in on shocking birth. Woman delivers non-human creatures. A miracle or a threat? Authorities investigating. Is this the start of something bigger? Scientists, theologians, and conspiracy theorists debated endlessly on live television. Some claimed the creatures were a sign of divine intervention. Others insisted they were the product of advanced genetic experiments gone wrong. Religious groups called for answers, while government agencies quietly began their investigations. Inside the hospital, Emily remained oblivious to the storm raging outside. All she knew was that her children, whatever they were, needed her protection. That night, as the hospital quieted and the chaos outside faded to a dull hum, Emily sat in her room alone. The lights were dimmed, and the only sounds were the faint beeps of the monitors and the soft chirps of the creatures beside her. She stood slowly, her body aching, and shuffled over to the bassinets. One of the creatures blinked up at her, its dark eyes reflecting the faint light in the room. Without hesitation, Emily reached out and touched its tiny clawed hand. A sudden warmth spread through her fingertips, radiating up her arm and into her chest. It wasn't painful. On the contrary, it was soothing, like being wrapped in a blanket on a cold night. You're special, aren't you? She whispered, tears filling her eyes. You're not here to hurt anyone. You're here for a reason. The creature cooed softly, nuzzling its tiny head into her palm. Emily smiled faintly, her heart swelling with love she couldn't explain. They don't understand you yet, she murmured. But I do. And I'll protect you. Outside her window, the first rays of dawn began to creep across the sky. The morning sun crept into Emily's hospital room, its soft glow spilling over the bassinets lined against the wall. The 6 dragon-like creatures were still nestled inside, their scales shimmering faintly in the dim light. Their soft chirps had quieted, and for the first time since their birth, the room felt calm. But the calm didn't last. Emily stirred awake as a sharp knock startled her. The door swung open before she could answer, and 2 men in dark suits entered, their expressions grim. Behind them, Dr. Reese and Dr. Patel followed, looking tense. "Ms. Emily Whitaker?" one of the men said, flashing a badge before tucking it back into his pocket. "We're with the Department of Scientific Investigations and Emerging Threats. You'll refer to us as Agents Hale and Lang." "Threats?" Emily croaked, sitting up slowly. "What are you talking about? Who let you in here?" "Ms. Whitaker, you're not in a position to ask questions," Agent Hale said, his tone clipped. His sharp eyes scanned the bassinets, lingering on the creatures inside. "We're here to assess the situation." Dr. Reese stepped forward, his voice firm. "These are my patients, Agent Hale. You don't have the right to—" "With all due respect, Doctor," Agent Lang interrupted, "this situation has escalated beyond the hospital's control. These creatures," he gestured toward the bassinets, "pose potential risks to public safety. We have orders to take custody of them." Emily's chest tightened. "Custody?" She swung her legs off the bed, ignoring the pain that shot through her body. "Oh, you can't take them. They're not human, Ms. Whitaker," Agent Hale said coldly. "We don't know what they are, where they came from, or what they're capable of. The government has a responsibility to investigate." Emily felt her pulse quicken, panic flooding her veins. "They're babies," she snapped. "They're harmless. You can't just take them like they're objects." Agent Hale ignored her protests and stepped toward the bassinets. One of the creatures stirred, its tiny wings twitching as though sensing the tension in the room. Emily lunged forward, blocking his path. "You're not touching them," she growled, her voice shaking. "Ms. Whitaker, step aside," Agent Lang ordered, his voice sharp. "No," Emily shouted. "They're mine. I won't let you take them." Dr. Patel moved quickly to Emily's side, placing a calming hand on her shoulder. "Emily, let's not make this worse," she whispered softly. "We'll figure this out." Emily's breath hitched, her body trembling as she looked back at the bassinets. The creatures, her children, were awake now, their dark eyes blinking as they cooed softly, sensing her distress. Agent Hale scowled and turned to Dr. Reese. "Doctor, you have 2 options. Either you cooperate, or we'll bring in federal personnel to seize the creatures ourselves. Your choice." Dr. Reese's jaw clenched, his face pale as he exchanged a look with Emily. "This isn't right," he muttered. "They're innocent." "Do the right thing," Emily pleaded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Please." In the hallway outside, the hospital had become a war zone. Security guards stood at every entrance, reporters screamed questions at anyone who walked past, and scientists argued loudly over protocols. Crowds of protesters had gathered outside the building, some holding signs that read, "Dragons are a miracle. This is a scientific breakthrough. Stop experiments on non-humans." Others, however, were more hostile. "End the threat. Is this the end of humanity?" Helicopters hovered overhead, the sound of their blades vibrating through the hospital walls. Emily could hear it all, even from her room, and the noise made her stomach churn. Inside, the tension grew unbearable. Dr. Reese pulled Emily aside while Agent Hale and Lang spoke quietly in the corner. "Emily," he said softly, "they're not going to stop. The government wants control of this situation." Emily's throat tightened. "But they're mine. You can't let them take them." "I know," Dr. Reese said, his voice strained. "I'm doing everything I can to stall them. But if they bring in federal agents, we won't have a choice." Emily looked toward her children, now chirping softly in their bassinets. A deep, protective instinct welled up inside her, a fierce, primal need to shield them at all costs. "Then I'll take them," she whispered. Dr. Reese blinked, startled. "Take them? What are you?" "I'll run," Emily said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. "If no one here will protect them, I'll do it myself." Dr. Patel overheard and stepped closer. "Emily, that's not a good idea. You're not strong enough." I don't care, Emily snapped. They're my children. I'll do whatever I have to. Before either doctor could argue further, a loud crash echoed from down the hallway. Agent Hale's phone buzzed, and he answered it quickly, his face darkening. What do you mean the doors are breached? Contain them? Breached? Emily whispered, her heart pounding. Agent Lang glanced sharply at Emily and the doctors. The protesters, he said. They've broken into the hospital. Downstairs, chaos erupted as protesters flooded into the building, shouting and waving signs. Some demanded to see the creatures, while others screamed about protecting humanity from the threat. Security guards scrambled to maintain order, but the situation was spiraling out of control. Get them under control. Agent Hale barked into his phone, his frustration mounting. In the chaos, Emily saw her chance. She turned to Dr. Reese, her voice low but urgent. Help me, please. Dr. Reese hesitated, torn between duty and his conscience. But when he looked at Emily, her tear-streaked face, her trembling hands, he made his decision. Dr. Patel, go with her, he said quickly. I'll handle Hale and Lang. Dr. Patel blinked. What? Now? Dr. Reese barked. Dr. Patel didn't argue. She grabbed a large rolling bassinet, carefully placing the dragon-like creatures inside. Emily climbed out of bed, ignoring the pain that lanced through her body as she steadied herself. You're sure about this? Dr. Patel whispered as they moved toward the back exit. Emily nodded. I don't have a choice. The hospital hallways were chaos, filled with shouting voices, flashing lights, and the distant thud of footsteps. Dr. Patel pushed the bassinet quickly, guiding Emily through the maze of corridors as they avoided security guards and agents. Stay close to me, Dr. Patel murmured, glancing over her shoulder. We don't have much time. Emily limped alongside her, every step an effort, but she refused to stop. The creatures cooed softly inside the bassinet, their faint glow casting eerie shadows on the hospital walls. They reached the back exit just as alarms began blaring through the building. Dr. Patel swiped her ID card, and the door clicked open. A gust of cold morning air hit Emily's face as they stepped outside into the alleyway behind the hospital. Where now? Dr. Patel asked breathlessly. Emily glanced around, her mind racing. A delivery truck was parked a few yards away, its back doors open. Without hesitation, she motioned toward it. Together, they pushed the bassinet toward the truck, Emily grimacing with every step. She climbed inside first, reaching out to help Dr. Patel lift the creatures into the cargo hold. Get in, Emily urged. Dr. Patel hesitated, glancing back at the hospital. Emily, are you sure? Go! Emily shouted. Dr. Patel nodded, climbing in just as voices echoed from the alley entrance. The truck's engine roared to life, and with a shudder, it pulled away from the hospital. Emily collapsed against the cold metal wall, clutching the edge of the bassinet as tears streamed down her face. The creatures chirped softly, one of them nuzzling her trembling hand. You're safe now, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'll keep you safe. I promise. As the truck sped through the city streets, Emily closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. She didn't know where they were going or what the future held. But one thing was certain. No one was taking her children away from her.